Hello, PDC. We have a lot of people here. This is good. This is the first lunch session of the conference. And what we are about to present today in a lunch session is how to connect the dots together. And we are trying to take technologies that you've seen and you will see during this conference. And we'll try to come up with a nice teaser for you. So you can go and later on visit the sessions and figure out how the pieces fall together. And hopefully it will be helpful for you. My name is Kobi Avital. I'm a product unit manager in the Connected System division. And Mauricio Ordonez, he's setting the demo together, which is fairly complex, so bear with us. Putting all the pieces together for a 45-minute session is a challenge. So as part of the introduction, I would like to make sure that we set the expectation right in respect to what is a lunch session. It's a teaser. We will not drill down too much into the code, although the interesting points will be double-clicked, so to speak. We would like you to see how pieces fall together and later on in other sessions, based on what you would like to do later on when you go home, you can go and drill down. We would like to frame a nice, interesting problem for you that I'm sure that most of you, and by the way, we have about 82 to 85 people, ISVs, coming out of ISVs companies, some of, and the rest is probably IT Pro and some other places in the industry. I'm sure that you will find that this problem statement can be related to what you're doing. Then we would like to distill out of the problem statement a general purpose architecture, or what we call architecture pattern, that you can take a look at it and you can find that it could fit or not to your environment. The demo will go down into a specific scenario, kind of we are bringing back Contoso to life here. So we can talk about Contoso as well. Recap, takeaway that you will take out of this session. I think it interesting is what are the takeaways, and we'll try to frame them. Call for actions, what you're going to do when you go home, and a related session to drill down into. So let's start working on that. So we're all developing applications. I call them black boxes. We sell the application to the customers. Customer take it, buy hardware, install it, do a lot of customization in many cases, some of them less, spend money on training and deploy it and manage it. And you as an ISV, the best customer that you're having is someone that you already sold the software to, right? This is part of your, how we call it, IP. Who are the customers that you're having, and you can keep using this market to sell more and more products, much easier to acquire new customers. The problem that we are that we are having is whenever we increase the application capacity, whenever we do more, whenever we want to sell more to the customers, there is a barrier of entry. Customers don't really want to go through the heavy lifting of upgrading, testing, retraining their staff. And this is usually the barrier of entry to sell more to existing customers. So what can we do about that? Really, we were thinking about it and saying, let's try to find analogy from other industries. So let's go with an imaginary statement. Imagine that your application is the black box. Your application has an input and output connectors that you connect to it. And this application is connected to an extension bus somewhere that you are not in control, that you can go ahead and talk to it. This extension bus can be the facility, the fabric that you can plug in adds-on components that are communicating with the existing application that you already have on premise or wherever it is. So those pieces of applications that you are adding, you can sell to the customers, you can have a business model behind it, and they are communicating with the existing fabric or existing application that you are having. The beauty about that those extension applications are powered by someone else. So it means that you don't really need to go to add more hardware, you don't need to do upgrade. Someone else is powering it, someone else is taking care of it, you're pretty much just using it. So the black box on the left side is really using capabilities that are currently deployed on not on-premise, somewhere else, and there is a connection between the two. Makes a lot of sense. We've done it many times. The slots are, the slot for the bus, we can add the application. Hey, why don't we do it in software? The beauty is that we can. And we can do it now with the existing technologies. And how can we do it? Here we go. On the right side at the bottom, you heard today that .NET Service as part of Azure is a facility to connect application in a global scope, right? So we can use the .NET services through specific contracts that we have down here, so the specific contract that we can define with protocols that are available to communicate with applications that are extending the existing one through the fabric that is developed by this technology. On the left side here, we have something that I'm not sure that all of you have heard about, so it might be that this is the first time that you are hearing about it. So bear with me and go to the session to figure out what it is. We are investing significant amount of effort to help you to develop applications, .NET application, and to host them with an extension to the Windows application server. I will talk about it in a second so we'll know more. So it means that you can go, use existing asset, develop an application, connect it, make it a cloud aware, and connect it to the bus. Now this application here, as well as any other application where they're hosted, can communicate with the existing applications. This is fabulous. If we can do that, it means that we have core application on site, we have extensions somewhere that either we as an ISV host on our premise, or we host them on the cloud. All of them are communicating through the service bus, and the world looks much better now. So let's talk a little bit about .NET services and what we are focusing here. .NET services, as we said, provide you the connectivity between applications to make it a distributed application in the global boundaries. Some of you probably familiar about BizTalk.net. We had introduced that a few months ago. It was available. People can access it. So if you heard about it, this is the evolution of the name. And .NET services, what we have today, provide three major services. The service bus. The service bus, if you can think about it, is everyone is probably in some time in your development of software applications, you heard about enterprise service bus, which connect the pieces inside the enterprise. We look at it and say, yeah, enterprise service bus, it's good, but it's only one section of what we really want to make connections. We really want to have a connection on a global frame. So my enterprise can connect it to another enterprise through the internet. So here we go. The service bus is an extension. It's an Uber view of all the messaging across on a global scope. And we have services to allow you to connect point to point. And we have services that allow you to do pub subscribe. So you can publish messages, you can subscribe to them, and get them and process them. Side by side with having the communication facility for messages, we have access control built in. And this is what Bob Muglia at the keynote was talking about. It is connected and it is secure in the same sentence. So we have to make sure that we are using the built-in connectivity, access control to ensure safer connections and good control on the access between the 2 points. The last piece kind of doesn't look the same, but in a sense it's the same. And what we say, if you build application we all know that when you have service-oriented application or web services type application, one of the difficult part is how do you manage stateful services on in a web services type of environment. Workflow is a fundamental building block that you can build your own application and develop it in that way that the workflow will take, will help you to build the statefulness of your application. At the bottom part of the slide, you see the business benefit. It helps you to use it as you need. You don't need to deal with the hardware. You can just start to use it on a smaller scale and extend it as you need based on the business requirements. Let's go into the Windows Application Server extension, which is what we call the codename Dublin. By the way, my shirt has the codename Dublin on it. What we have done, we extend the IIS and WAS in order to help you to take existing asset of .NET services, .cf and .f, and to host it for you in an environment that is much easier to manage. If you used it in the earliest release of .NET, you know that once you do it and you need to host it, you build your own host. But when this host has to scale up and scale out, it was your issue to deal with, how to manage it, how to control the services themselves. So Dublin is sitting as part of Windows Application Server, Windows Server, right? On top of WAS and IIS, using the .NET framework, and it helps you to host those services. We give administration tools, we give monitoring, we give persistent services, we give versioning. So for you, just focus on what you really need to do. Build the services that help your business and deploy them into the Dublin server on-premise. The tooling to develop the application are, as always, Visual Studio. It is integrated to the modeling system, modeling framework that Bob Moose said at the last few minutes of his presentation. Modeling Oslo is the modeling platform, and of course, System Center to control it. Let's go, as we said, to the problem statement. First, I have an announcement, good news, that Contoso has managed to overcome the recall of the batteries. And why? Because they're still hiring. And our example is about hiring. Contoso, global organization, many departments, many divisions. They have onboarding process. Everyone knows that onboarding processes. And the focus of the discussion is not actually the business scenario, it's how we really solve the problem here, which is built on top of SharePoint. So every department has their own onboarding on top of SharePoint. And part of their problem is how to automate a process where they want to engage relocation vendors as part of the onboarding. You know that you hire someone from remote, you need to move them from point A to point B, housing, the whole shebang. But they want to make improvement to their process and to automate it in a most non-destructive way. They don't want to do an upgrade, they don't want to make massive changes, they don't really, it has to be loosely coupled as much as possible, not too much configuration. And they were trying to solve it. So they came to the IT department and they explained them how they do business today and how they do it today. Department on the left need to relocate an applicant. They send email to vendors on the right. Vendors look at it, they say it will cost you so and so, send an email back. HR department say you win, you lose, go for it. Interesting process, manual-driven process. How do you know what is the state of the relocation of each individual applicants? How do you look at it in a global view of the whole company? Do you know what is the cost? Nobody knows. It's kind of a black box between HR person and a vendor. What about compliance? We don't know. And of course, global organization has to deal with it. So they came to the IT department, and the IT department say, hey, guys, we have web services. Definitely we can use them. It's a good thing. Yeah, we know that it's a good thing. And we can do that. there is some issue about it because web services is tightly coupled. You know the endpoint, you know who to talk to. Either you use their contract or you define your own contract that the vendor has to follow. So take 100 departments, 5 vendors per department, multiple all of it, you have that many versions of your applications. Every place that you make a connection like that, you need to change configuration file, make sure that the contracts are in place. And who knows even what is the service level agreement? What do you get? How many changes is happening? And what happens if you're adding another vendor? Then you need to make another software change. So web services are good, and we all love them and using them a lot, but there are some challenges here. So they came to us and we say, you know, we have now new technology that you may use. And from there we go into an architectural pattern that I would like to spend some time on. And this is, in a sense, a structure, an architecture that you can really use. Let's take a look. On the left, you have the black box. The black box has 2 connectors, output connector and input connector, as we have in the imaginary world. On the right, we have the extension application, connecting like into slots, right? One slot here, slot here. And the fabric in between is the .NET services. .NET services provide us the connectivity between the two across boundaries of enterprise, allowing you to publish messages and to get updates in a secure world. This is a secure environment, and the more services that we are adding to that, the more you can use. So if looking at that, what do we really need to do? Contoso, you come to Contoso, you come to your service, and I know my application. I know what business events I have in my application. I know who needs to talk to me, so there is a contract, how to talk, where to listen, the whole WCF thing. There is some behavior that you need to get into it. It means you need to react based on this call and do this and that. So what we are doing, you can go and you build into your application what we call event handler. This piece of code is intercepting events, transactions out of your application, connected itself to the bus, and publish messages to the bus in a broadcast mode. We are publishing those messages. The vendors that want to talk to you, they have connection. They're subscribing to those events through a specific port, to specific endpoints. And of course, it has to be secure, so they have to get the right credentials in order to listen to those messages. And once they intercept it, they can react to it and send updates to your application through this port, through the input port. It's a virtual port. It's not like a port that... So now you take your application, you publish business events, you expose interaction points with your application, and by having, in our case, in the case of Contoso, vendors interacting with it, you build an extension to your application. And pretty much sky is the limit here. You can expose as many events that you want, and you have application listening to it. It can be to any type of reason. And you will see in the actual demo, we show a few level of solution that you can take advantage of that. I hope that it's clear so far. And to summarize, we have connectivity to the service bus, pub subscribe model, access control, secure, and services contracts to communicate between the pods. So now I hand off the presentation to Maurizio, and he will show you the demo.
Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, so for the demo, what I'm going to show you is how we've implemented the pattern that Kobe talked about on a variety of Microsoft technologies, both current and future. So Kobe mentioned that Contoso had built their HR application using SharePoint. This is SharePoint 2007. Like any good SharePoint application, they're using InfoPath to collect some information. They're going to store that on a SharePoint list. This is fairly standard SharePoint stuff. So here we have the application. I'm just going to click on this button and fill out the form. And that form was created with InfoPath, and the data is getting saved onto a SharePoint list. Now, at this point, we're collecting the information in SharePoint. We can collaborate, but it would be a lot nicer if I could just take that information that's stored on my SharePoint list and automatically send it to the vendors to kick off that process. So let's do that. So I'm going to go into my SharePoint list settings, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to associate a workflow that I've developed, and I'm going to call this workflow the event publisher, using the same terminology that Kobe talked about. And what I'm going to say is that I want to run this workflow every time a new item is created. Okay, workflow is associated. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and create a new request. Okay, so once again, I've submitted the request. And now, because of the workflow that I associated, it was in that code where I've done all the necessary work to connect my existing SharePoint application with the Internet Service Bus that is part of Microsoft.NET Services. And all of the other vendors that are participating in this business process, they too are connected to the Service Bus, and they're listening for the event, and they will process the information and send me back requests to my bid. So let's see if by now they've had time to fill out their information. Ah, yes, we see. We have now a bunch of tasks that were created in SharePoint saying that I need to review some bids, and I have some proposals that have come back over here. So I'm going to go ahead and looks like relocation vendor A sent us the smallest bid. So I'm going to go ahead and click on that, and I'm going to go ahead and accept the bid. So this last form, all of that information was created by our application. So what happened? What did we just see? Let's switch back to the slides. Okay, so we're going to do an architecture walkthrough of this application. So I mentioned that we started with a SharePoint application, and in SharePoint, all data is stored on a list. So when I associated the workflow with that list, what I'm essentially doing is I'm creating the outbound connection into the service bus. And you'll notice there that it says that we're using something called the relay binding. I'm going to go into more details about what that binding is, but it's essentially the WCF binding that allows me to talk to the service bus. So that's what I'm doing. I connect to the infrastructure, and now the vendors, they too are also connected, and so we're all able to communicate. And then when I create a new bid, I'm publishing a message. I'm publishing an event from my application into the service bus. How do we do that? Well, Kobe talked about this notion that our applications have business events, and what we need to do in order to implement this pattern is intercept those business events, and using publish and subscribe semantics, publish them into the service bus. That's part of the service bus architecture. And so in SharePoint already has defined an event pipeline. It begins from when you create an item, goes through a series of stages of the pipeline, and it finishes with a workflow activation if one workflow has been associated with the list. So that's where we chose to intercept the event, at the workflow activation level. We did that because we like the declarative programming style of workflow. Okay, then we brought up, when we developed this workflow, we did it in Visual Studio 2008 because SharePoint 2007 uses the Workflow 3.0 engine. And if you've developed any SharePoint workflow, this will probably look very familiar to you. The first activity in the sequential workflow says on workflow activated. This is required by SharePoint, and it's the first activity that catches the event from SharePoint, and it brings that context into our workflow. So the real work actually happens in the second activity, which is something that we wrote. We call that activity the publisher activity, and it has an execute method, and that's where the real work happens. So as Kobe mentioned, the service bus, you always have to authenticate because we have an access control service. So the first step in connecting to the service bus is I must authenticate. And the way that's done is using an endpoint behavior. There's a couple of different types of credentials that I can use in order to authenticate. If this were a a desktop application, I could use something like CardSpace, but because this is a server-to-service application where I don't have a UI that I can pop up on my server, I'm using certificates. The next thing I must do is I have to specify an address. This is like any good WCF programming. I have to specify an address. And the first half of that address is something that's predefined for me by the service bus. And it's up until the point where we see Contoso. That is the name of our solution. So this URI is essentially partitioned. Everything after Contoso is entirely up to me to determine how I want to partition that hierarchy. So here we've chosen something simple that just says relocation published service. Okay, then I'm going to construct my channel. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to specify the event relay binding. And this is important because it's the event relay binding, the one that gives you that publish and subscribe capability. And what it does is it actually uses a multicast datagram style of messaging. Okay, so once I've constructed my channel, I simply go ahead and send the message. And you saw from today's talk that when we say that with .NET Services, your skills transfer to this new platform, here this is just general WCF programming, except that we have a slightly different binding, some slightly different endpoint behaviors, and we're communicating with the service bus. Notice that one thing I didn't have to do is I didn't have to do anything like open a port on my firewall or move my SharePoint site out somewhere where it's accessible from the internet. My site is still, can still be behind the firewall. It can be behind a NAT, and the service bus, this communication takes care of making sure that all that traversal happens. So my server's never, you can't ping it from the internet. Okay, so now once we send the message into the service bus, because we're using that event relay binding, what that's going to mean is that all the vendors are going to get the message. All the vendors are also listening in on that same address. So essentially, we use that as a rendezvous location, and the vendors will get the message. So they'll go ahead and do their thing. They'll send me back their proposals, and they'll send it to a service that we've developed that's the inbound port. This service is also using the relay binding because it needs to talk to the service bus. And this is how we implemented the inbound connection. It's essentially the mirror of the sending code. I'm going to use, once again, I'm going to have to authenticate using the certificates. I have an address, and because I'm creating a service, I'm listening in for messages that are coming from the service bus. I'm actually going to create a service host. And I'm going to create a relay binding, but I'm creating one that's slightly different. This one just says net TCP relay binding. If you recall, the other one was a net event relay binding. The reason why I'm switching is because I'm going from pub sub messaging to point, because if you think about the business process, once a vendor is sending me a proposal, they don't need to send it to everybody else that's participating in the conversation. They just want to send it to me directly. So we switch to point communications. Okay, then we open the host, and that's how we're listening into messages. And then finally, the actual implementation of the service operation is just calling the SharePoint API. We've received the message. We're just going to call through the SharePoint API and get that data onto the list, create tasks, etc. Okay, so what do we just see? We saw how we can take an existing application that's currently deployed. I can take that and with just some minor modifications, intercepting events at the right place in my pipeline, I can connect them to the service bus. I don't need to reconfigure my firewall, and I'm able to extend the reach of that application with these other participants that are involved in the business process. And that's great. Now I've totally improved the quality of the application. I'm able to deliver more functionality. But but maybe there's more that I can do. In Kobe, in the Imagine slide, he had this notion that we can take application functionality and drop it in as if it were cards on a PC. So maybe we can do something more like that. So one of the things that Contoso would like to do is they would like to take actually I need to show you my animation. Right, so we're going to drop in the new application like a card on a PC. So one of the things that Contoso would like to do is they would like to, now that they've connected all of their subsidiaries and all of their vendors through this common infrastructure, one of the things that they would like to do is they would like to make use of all that, of all the traffic that's going through the service bus and add some additional capability. In this case, what they want to do is they want to add some monitoring into the process. So I'm going to go ahead and bring up an application that they've developed. Yeah, if you can switch, please. Okay. I'm actually looking at the wrong one here. Okay, this is my monitoring application. What the monitoring application has done is it's also been listening in to messages on the service bus. And here we go. And as you can see, it's captured a number of events that have all transpired throughout this demo. And if you actually look at the time, this is happening in real time. My monitoring application too is a subscriber into the events that are happening on the bus, and so it's keeping a list of all that activity. And now you can imagine that I could build some pretty fancy reporting or analytics on top of the events. But maybe we can do more than that. It certainly, once we have this information, then from here it's just only like one step further to think about how we could use this information and implement some corporate policies. So somebody at Contoso decides that what they want to do is they want to ensure some quality of service, some minimum level of service from the vendors, and they're going to ask their employees to rate the vendors, and if the vendors falls below a certain threshold, they're going to suspend business with that vendor. So they've created an application where what they're going to do is they're going to here I could rate the vendor, and I could I'm going to rate it lower. But let me show you something. One of the things that we have in the services platform is the access control service. And you saw this a little bit on the demo. Let me explain what this is about. So we have a secure token service that's also running as part of .NET Services, and I can use this to create essentially security rules for my application. And I can customize it, and I can do claims-based authorization for my application. And it just so happens that the service bus also uses the access control service to manage its security rules. So here I'm looking at the rules that have been defined for the access control service. And we see that we have a number of input claims that say, that basically these are identity claims we can say for this user, in this case vendor A. They're able, the action that they're able to do is listen or send. And so this lists essentially all the people that can send in this conversation. So one thing about the service bus is that it's secure. Not only do I have to authenticate myself, but also if I wanted message level security, I could also implement that. So we can go ahead and if we wanted to implement that policy that Contoso talked about, we can go ahead and disable each one of those rules. And now at this point, that vendor is locked out. They can no longer communicate. Okay, I'm going to enable it back on. Now you might think at this point, that's really good because a system administrator can just go to a single console in the .NET Services portal and manage all of their security through that single portal. But maybe what happens if somebody always has to remember to go and do that? Maybe I can be a little bit more clever and automate the step based on the information that I'm gathering as a result of my business process. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at my monitoring application, which I've developed using some of the new capability in .NET 4.0. And I've written this application as a workflow service. So I'm writing a service application using declarative language. Here we see the new workflow designer. If you compare it with the image on PowerPoint that I showed you earlier, here we see the new design surface. And this workflow begins with a service operation, which is what receives the original message. And I'm going to look at the first sequence. And we see here that in this workflow, what we've done is we listen to we inspect the event, we have an activity to log it, and then we've also defined a rule for the workflow. So I'm going to expand it. And in this rule set, we have an activity that's going to revoke the claims. And actually, I have on my desktop the text that I want to paste. Just going to copy this. Okay, so I paste a rule that says if the relocation rating is less than 3, then that's going to execute the left side of that activity. And so I'm going to save it. So notice also that the way I define that expression is using a different expression language than what we had in 3.0. This is a lot more Visual Basic-like, if you will, because it is in fact Visual Basic based. So one of the things that we're doing in .NET 4 is unifying the expression language that's used in the workflows. Okay, so I've saved that, and now I'm going to switch. Oh. It's okay. Okay, so now I'm going to switch. I'm going to go ahead and rate the vendor a 2. Okay, now let's take a look at my monitoring application. Let's see. Okay, so we see that the monitoring application has detected that a rule has kicked in. And if I look at the access control service, refresh. Okay, we see that relocation vendor A is grayed out. It's been programmatically disabled. How do we do that? Well, when the SharePoint application sent the messages, I mentioned that we had written this workflow that is listening in for events that are happening on the service bus. I've written this workflow, and whenever you write a workflow, you need to also think about where you're going to host this workflow. And so you might think about writing your own workflow service host. But in this case, what I'm doing is I'm deploying it inside of the Dublin application server, the Windows application server with Dublin extensions, so that I don't have to think about how am I going to make this workflow persist, how am I going to handle the persistence or scale out or versioning. Those are all things that the Dublin application server will handle for my workflow. I just have to worry about defining the business logic that's stored in the workflow. So I have the activity that's going to log the event. That sends it to the database, and then when the result comes back, I have some communication with the monitoring service, and then we're going to, when the rule kicks in, I talk to the access control service through the client API, and then once we disable the rule, that relocation vendor, we essentially revoke the claims that enable it to send and receive messages. Okay, so how do we do that? Well, for the supervisor service, the act of sending and receiving is very much the same as what we saw earlier. So there's no change here. And then we created a workflow where we had our rule defined, and there we wrote an activity where we actually talk to the access control service. And when we look at the execute method, we see that once again it's fairly similar. I have to authenticate with the service, and then what I'm doing is I'm using this class called the Identity Management Client. This is the Access Control Service API. Access Control Service has the portal, which is the web UI that I showed you, and also has an API that allows me to programmatically control the rules that I've defined. So that's what I'm going to do here. I'm going to specify that I want the scope or the application called Service Bus, which defines the rules that the Service Bus uses for for specifying who can send and receive. And then I'm going to enumerate through all the rules. I'm going to find the one that matches my vendor, and then I set the status to false, meaning I've disabled it. And that's pretty much it. At this point, that's when the rule is disabled and the vendor is no longer able to send messages. And that's the conclusion to our demo.
That's good. You hear me? Anyway, takeaways from today's session. Take your application, examine it, create your own extensions, and publish it to the bus, right? That's whenever you do it, you can allow connections and connectivity. Service bus can help us to extend our application and reach across global organizations and make our application much more viable. We use a safe communication facility through the access control and identity management, and of course Dublin can help us to host our additional extensions to our application. So those are interesting topics that you guys need to take a look and think how it applies to your application, and of course take a look at the sessions that are available now. Anywhere you see Dublin, go and take a look how you can host your .NET services. Azure and the .NET services are extremely important for you in order to make this happen. And what you really need to do after that is just to go and to, oh, what is that? You go to update, to take the code out of your goods from the software that you got during the PDC and try to make it happen. Please don't forget to fill the evaluation forms and enjoy the PDC.
Thank you.